As always, before the benchmarks and all that kind of stuff, let's go over the parts inside of this computer and what we're going to be using. So first up, the graphics card. We got an RTX 4070 Ti that we're going to be installing in this, specifically the GALAX version, because we are going to be using a new HYTE case. And personally, I think that that is one of the coolest GPUs to install in a HYTE case because it's flipped vertically. We also got the new Arctic cooler, the AIO, that was released, specifically the white one. This is going to be an all white build. So fully aware, a 15 watt or a 1500 watt power supply is totally not necessary for an RTX 4070 Ti, but the owner is eventually going to be upgrading to an RTX 4090. So that is why I'm going to be installing a 1500 watt Be Quiet power supply. So we also have an RTX 14700K that we're going to be installing in this. We got a 1 terabyte NVMe also going to be installing in this. We got 32 gigabytes of DDR5 RAM that we're going to be, wait for it, installing in this. We also have an MSI Z790 that we're going to be using. This is going to fit the build pretty well. It is more of a gray tone than a white tone, but overall it's going to look good inside of the computer. We also got some Be Quiet RGB fans that I might use. I'm not 100% sure if I'm going to use these or if I'm going to be using the up here fans, because I'm not sure what is going to go well all together. I like to build very like aesthetic looking computers, if that makes any sense. And because of that, I'm not sure if this is going to fit with the graphics card AIO and then the HYTE case, or if I'm going to be using my other fans, the Be Quiet or the up here fans. So this right here is a modular 1500 watt power supply from Be Quiet. It's Be Quiet. It's one of my favorite PC brand companies. But I know I'm already going to get people wondering why I have a 1500 watt power supply for an i7 and a 4070 Ti. It is because the owner wants to be able to upgrade this computer in the future. He's going to be upgrading to an RTX 4090, and then eventually when the 50 series comes out, he's probably going to be getting a 5080 or a 5090 as well. So now we're going to go ahead, benchmark, test performance, and all of that kind of stuff. I have tons of videos building computers, so I'm not going to put it together. You can go and watch some other guide that I have. So let's go into the benchmarks, performance, and all that kind of stuff. The first game that we're going to be testing out here is Call of Duty Warzone on ultra settings at 2560 by 1440p. You're going to average roughly 90 frames per second. High settings, you're going to average roughly 150 frames per second. Medium settings, you're going to hover around 180 to 190 frames per second. And then low settings, you're going to be hovering around 260 frames per second. If we bump Call of Duty Warzone up to 3840 by 2160 on ultra settings, you're going to hover around 50 frames per second. High settings around 80 frames per second. Medium settings 100 frames per second, and then low settings about 140 frames per second. Moving on to the next game, Fortnite at 1440p. On ultra settings, you're going to get about 100 FPS. High settings 200 FPS. Medium settings 250 FPS. Low settings 340 FPS. If we bump Fortnite up to 4K, on ultra settings, you're going to get about 55 FPS. High settings 100 FPS. Medium settings 130 FPS. Low settings 170 FPS. Moving on to the next game, Cyberpunk 2077 at 1440p. On ultra settings, you're going to get about 90 FPS. High settings about 150 FPS. Medium settings 180 FPS. Low settings 225 FPS. If we take Cyberpunk 2077 and move into 4K, on ultra settings, you're going to get about 45 FPS. High settings about 80 FPS, medium settings 100 FPS, and then low settings 140 FPS. Moving on to the next game, Grand Theft Auto 5. At 1440p ultra settings, you're going to get about 100 FPS, high settings 150 FPS, medium settings 200 FPS, and then low settings 240 FPS. If we bump GTA 5 up to 4K, ultra settings 60 frames per second, high settings 100 frames per second, medium settings 120, low settings 150 FPS. That's what you can expect from this computer. Overall, it runs and honestly looks amazing. The new HYTE 70 case is, at least in my opinion, a lot better than the HYTE 60. It's nice to be able to install 3 fans on the side and not just 2. But other than that, it's really just aesthetics that they ended up changing with this thing. And they did add some like quality of life improvements to this as well. Like the rubber grommets on it are changed. The back, how the back is laid out is changed. And overall, it was a nice experience building inside of this computer case.